My Lords, I surprised myself by taking as my starting point agreement with the noble Lord Newby and the noble Lord Ffoulkes, and that is that in a democratic society there is always a case for a democratically elected legislature, and that is to understate the matter, I would have thought. Legitimacy in a democratic society is derived primarily from election, but for a conservative, legitimacy can also be derived from history and from tradition. It might sound a little bit quixotic to say that, but large numbers of people in this country completely understand it. It's why they have as much respect as they do, so very much respect as they do, for the monarchy. And it is the presence of hereditary peers in this House which maintain that strand of legitimacy, because being an appointed House, being appointed gives you no legitimacy at all. To the majority of people, it just looks like cronyism. And that isn't addressed, if I may say so, with respect to the noble Lord Burt, who has just spoken, and others. That isn't addressed by having a statutory HOLAC, because if that isn't elected, if it isn't in itself a form of electoral college, then where does the electoral legitimacy reside that justifies its appointment of the people it would appoint to the legislature? One ends up in an infinite regress. So there is no legitimacy in that. Those who say that you can't have two democratic chambers seem to have missed what has happened in at least 100 countries I can think of. Even in the United States, they managed to pass a huge amount of legislation, and that is a country where they deliberately designed the legislature to have a degree of conservatism, shall we say, a degree of holding back. So that needs to be our starting point. Why shouldn't we be a democratic House? And where does our legitimacy derive from? Now, there is a large measure of agreement amongst us on the need for reform. And the passing of the hereditaries has always been part of that. There has been a consensus about that for the last 25 years. That is not what this argument is about. This argument is not about the passage of the hereditaries as such. It is about the context in which that happens. And that context is meant to be, and has been pledged to be, a reform of this House. And I'm not going back to what Tony Blair may have said to somebody in a corridor or behind the Lord Speaker's, behind the woolsack or whatever in the past. I'm going to this Labour Party's manifesto. The noble Lord Earl Kinnoul said there were I've identified 7 proposals in it, and they come under the heading immediate reform of the House of Lords. Those are the words in the manifesto, a copy of which I have been careful to bring with me in case there is any dispute about it. They are removing the hereditaries. They are mandatory retirement at 80. There is a revision of the Code of Standards. There is the removal of disgraced members. There is a requirement for participation. There is a reform of the appointments process. And there is a commitment to addressing national and regional balance. All of those come under the heading, these things will be done immediately. They are not being done immediately. That is the problem. The democratisation of the House, which is also mentioned in the manifesto, is something that they say will be consulted on. It is not to be done immediately. But the 7 I've read out are. And they are not. And so this government, in my view, has no mandate to introduce one of them outside that context, to revert to the argument that getting rid of the hereditaries is what it's all about, when in fact it isn't. It has always, for the last 25 years, been about the reform of the House of Lords and removing the hereditaries only in a context that provides a new form of legitimacy. Because we all know in practice that nothing is going to be done about those things. We know that they are being kicked into the long grass, and we are very unlikely to see them again, except possibly for a few administrative matters which can be dealt with very easily. My Lords, we've had arguments over the last century about the reform of the House of Lords, and I join with others in saying this, or something along these lines. In 1910, in 1948, There were constitutional conferences held between both houses of Parliament on precisely this type of question. We should do that again. Neither of them succeeded, but they had the great merit that they informed the legislation the government then brought forward so that it was much more acceptable and turned out to work. We need to see this in its proper context. We need to find a compromise. A conference of that character will be the best way forward while this bill is withdrawn.
Yeah.